Almost ready, almost there. Or is it already over? A friend in need, a friend indeed, needs a new episode of Columbia House Party. Jake, what's going on, man?
Not much. I am ready to go today. Feeling good. I don't know what the podcast equivalent of limber is.
I don't know either. Buttery?
Buttery, yeah.
Is that what we want our voice to be?
I think buttery works. I've got a coffee going.
Jake's feeling buttery. We're ready to go.
That's how you want to start the show.
Yeah, I feel a little less buttery than you. A little margarine-y. I don't know.
You feeling the drag?
No, I just had my second online, digital therapy session, which has been, I haven't had a lot of success with therapy in general, but doing it digitally is an extra adjustment period that I'm still getting used to. But
yeah, I've been curious about that. I know that my therapist has been offering it, but I've yet to partake because I think I feel similar to you around the sort of uncertainty of it. How is it?
It's okay. The nice thing is that I don't have to do the 30-minute transit home after
right.
Where I'm just miserable and exhausted. So that part's been nice. I could just roll right into doing a podcast. But yeah, it's a bit of an adjustment, but it's fine. Jake, we got a fun one today. A guest we're very, very excited to have on. A guest, I think, we talked about with the Constantine's episode, how the Discord kind of willed that one into existence. The Discord group just made this one happen. There was no willing it. It was just Angelo taking over and getting it done. The impact of the Descendents traces back further and through multiple derivations, but is a lot more direct on many of the bands that we've already covered. That you would expect because this is also the oldest album we've done an episode on so far on Columbia House Party. Jake, what do you have for us today?
So this album for me is, I think, one that's almost bigger in stature in terms of, as you said, influence and where it's placed in the genre than it is for me personally. However, I do remember very clearly when I was a teenager, my weekend activity was what I called going downtown, which just meant going to the big HMV down at Yonge and Dundas and the old Sam the Record Man and Sunrise. There's sort of those three all across the street from each other way back in the day.
No, now it's just a giant Steve Sladkowski floating head when they release new music, right?
That's
Yonge
right.
Dundas Square.
The pup billboards, bless them.
Yes.
But I remember this record specifically as being one that I would go up to the second floor of HMV, and along the, I guess, north-facing wall was the punk section, which is where I sort of plied my trade, so to speak. And I remember there was many years of not buying this record, but always seeing the cover art and finding it very striking and very interesting. And I'd heard the name in, online forums I browsed and conversations with friends who were into the same kind of music as me. And then one day I was like, you know what? It's time finally for me to grab this record. And I remember very clearly getting it and the cashier looking at me and giving me one of those cool record store employee nods. And I was like, yeah, this is the one I want. I think it's not a record I go back to a lot. It's probably my least favorite record in this band's discography. But as you pointed out, it's probably the most important. So today we are talking about the 1982 album by Descendents, Milo Goes to College.
And to help us go through Milo Goes to College, we have a guest we're super, super excited about. Again, the Discord kind of made this happen, but he's very high on our list when we brainstormed potential guests initially. Today, we're joined by author, poet, culture writer, and all-around dream guest, Hanif Abdurraqib. Hanif, how's it going, man?
Good. Thanks for having me, and I hope y'all are holding up well and being good to yourselves when you can.
As well as we can. How's everything for you on that end?
It's good. Yeah, I mean, I'm home in Columbus, Ohio, and it's It's interesting here because the weather is kind of like perpetually in between 50 and 60 degrees and kind of cloudy, but it's all right. I'm staying occupied and trying to stay optimistic.
You are, if I'm remembering right, you're a runner, right? So that's kind of the sweet spot for running weather, at least, right?
It is, yeah. I mean, I've been trying to get out in the mornings and work out in the mornings because it kind of, I think, lifts my mental health spirits and emotional spirits. And it also just kind of like I'm a runner, but I don't like running. I don't enjoy it. I don't do it. I don't do it to like get in shape. I don't have like fitness goals. I think at this point I kind of do it because I need to. I just feel better after it. And it's just like a bit of a habit for me. I played soccer in high school and college. And so much of my life has been built around running long distances that I think if I stopped now, it would not be good for me. So I like doing it in the morning because if I can get something I really don't like doing out of the way in the morning, it bodes well for my day.
That's perfect. That's I ran to the album we're talking about today the other day, and it was really disorienting because this album is 15 songs and 22 minutes long, and I was on this run and I'm like, 10 songs have gone by, how am I only this far into my run? But when they're all 80, 90 seconds, it trips you up a little bit. Guys, if you're listening to this podcast, you surely know Hanif already. If not, you can find him on all your socials at Neef Muhammad. You can find his work and his portfolio at abdurraqib.com. We'll put the links to those things in the episode description, so look there. And then obviously you can find him on Twitter as well. If you haven't checked out any of his books of poetry or books of essays, please do that. They Can't Kill Us Until They Kill Us is one that specifically I think would speak to the audience of this podcast. A lot of great music-based essays. I realized the other day cleaning up my bookshelf that I have Steve from Pup's copy of that. So stories, Steve, I will get that back to you at some point.
It's okay. Steve has like three of my books, so it balances out.
And then thank you to Angelo from the Discord who reached out to Hanif on Twitter. Like I said, Hanif, you were at the top of our brainstorm list. I think you're fit with kind of what we're doing here is a no-brainer. What was not a no-brainer was what album we were going to do with you. I kind of opened it up to you, and I had no idea really where you were going to go because your music tastes are kind of all over, and even your music taste within the punk and emo genres cuts a pretty wide berth. So why this album for you? Why is Milo Goes to College the one you wanted to come on and talk with us about?
Well, because I think that largely I had spent some time thinking about the Descendents and how, while I don't think this is their best album, I think it's the most important, and I think it is the one that set a blueprint for a sound. And I've been thinking a lot about blueprint albums, like albums that people, lifted from. I think like the Pixies' Doolittle is another one of those albums, and Surfer Rosa, I think both of them. I think like in a different era, those Meters albums were albums that people kind of set blueprints off of. And so I was thinking about blueprint albums, and I think that the idea of pop punk as it's understood now is perhaps so far removed from what Milo Goes to College is. But I do think that this is one of those like Velvet Underground and Nico type joints where everyone who listened to it started a band kind of thing. And so I was thinking about it in that way. And I mean, to be clear, I think it's a very good album. It's an album I like a lot. But I also think a lot about the albums that kind of act as a dissection point or a roadmap into a kind of suburban haze that I just don't understand and otherwise would not have a lot of interest in, if not for the Descendants and, of course, later groups like the Wonder Years and things like that.
Yeah, I thought maybe you'd pick a Wonder Years album. I know you did an Instagram story kind of AMA recently, and the Wonder Years and your fondness for them came up. I think we agree on the best Wonder Years album. I think you said Greatest Generation is the best one, but No Closer to Heaven is the one you like the most, right?
Yeah, which I mean, and I think that in terms of like best and favorite differences and like delineating those things, that jumps out the most with me in the pop punk, because I think like I'm not exactly sure that. Actually, no, I do think Infinity High is the best Fall Out Boy album and my favorite. But I think there are a lot of bands where it's like the best album is not necessarily my favorite album. And I think, the Greatest Generation, I think, is almost undisputed, or well, slightly disputed as the greatest Wonder Years album. But it isn't the one that I return to the most anymore. And I think a part of that is quite simply because of how we age. You know what I mean? Like we age through a lot of eras, and those eras are served by different sounds and different ideas and different bands. And so that it feels important to kind of honor that.
I'd never really thought about sort of that best and favorite delineation by genre before. And as you were just speaking, I sort of started going in my brain of some of my best, or my favorite, but not best records. And so many of them are in the pop punk genre rather than sort of like the, quote unquote, big seminal albums. Like, I'm sure there's people who disagree because everyone disagrees on things, but like, you talk about Springsteen's greatest album is Born to Run, and then everyone's like, most people are like, yeah, okay, sure. And it's a lot of people's favorites as well. But then you go to pop punk, there's so many bands, like all the ones you just mentioned, and like countless others and all the bands we like, where it's not only more up for debate, but I do think there is sort of the importance / best, in quotes, idea. And so many people wouldn't credit those albums as their favorites, whether it's through Green Day or through Blink-182 or through smaller bands like the Wonder Years. I just think that's a really interesting point that is probably not unique to pop punk, but definitely in my sphere of reference feels more unique to pop punk.
Like, I think the emotional and nostalgic ties of pop punk can be a lot weightier and heavier for folks of our generation. And so like, there are albums that are undoubtedly the best by a band that I cannot return to as frequently for whatever emotional roadblock might be there. And so, I mean, The Greatest Generation is one of those albums. And so, yeah, I think there's that too with pop punk. There's that with all music, but I think that in pop punk it can jump out a little bit more ferociously.
Yeah, and that's kind of, the edict of this podcast, or at least when we do explore some of that like high school age or university age pop punk that Jake and I were attached to, or guests were attached to. It's come up a bunch. I don't want to hijack us too much with Wonder Years talk. Very excited to do a Wonder Years episode eventually. But I do think that what both of you just shared kind of tees up the Descendents well here, because, Jake, you said in the intro that it's not your favorite of their albums, and Hanif, you said it's maybe not their best, but I don't think there's any question that Milo Goes to College is their most influential. We're going to get into the specifics of Milo Goes to College after this. All right, Jake, take us away, man.
So, Descendents were formed, sort of, in 1977 by Frank Nevada and David Nolte, who began writing songs acoustically. They originally called themselves The Itch, until Nevada changed the name to Descendents. In 1978, Nevada began playing with drummer Bill Stevenson and bassist Tony Lombardo. Nolte was the original singer, but left in 1979. They would record a single without a quote-unquote lead singer, and released it on their own label, Orca Records. The sound, according to Stevenson, was rock, surf, pop, punk. Consisted of half-driving melodic bass lines, tight guitar riffing, and caffeinated surf beats. Stephen Blush, the author of American Hardcore, A Tribal History, described the original sound as a blend of Devo-style new wave and Dick Dale-like surf. Also of note, Stevenson and Nevada were teenagers at this time, while Lombardo was 34 when the band first started playing together. Lombardo would tell OC Weekly in 2013 that he began playing with them because of where I was in my life. I was not fully mature, and because of the music I loved, it really was no problem for me. Nevada and Lombardo sang on the single, and after a 6-month trial with a female vocalist, Cecilia Laura, as singer, they recruited Milo Aukerman. They would then release the Fat EP in 1982, which featured shorter, faster, and in the hardcore punk style of songs. They began preparing to record Milo Goes to College later that same year, working at Total Access Recording in Redondo Beach, California, with Spot, the legendary in-house producer for SST Records, who has produced records by bands of this era like Black Flag, The Minutemen, and Husker Du. One of the, perhaps, as I sort of mentioned off the top, more iconic things of this album and of most Descendents albums is the cartoon drawing of Milo on the cover. Aukerman told The Seeker that he never imagined the drawing would take off the way it did. What ended up happening at the start of it all was Bill and I both went to high school together. We had a high school friend named Roger. He used to draw these little cartoons to kind of entertain himself during boring classes. He was drawing these cartoons, and this cartoon character was based on me. He put it into certain cartoon strips, kind of making fun of me, the pratfalls of Milo, stupid shit I would do in high school, and he would document it in these little cartoons. We all got a big laugh out of it. I took it in stride. He was a friend of mine. It was all for a laugh. Then when we were getting ready to do that record, Bill contacted him and said Milo is going to college. This is going to be his swan song, his goodbye to the band. We're thinking of calling the record Milo Goes to College. I had no say in the matter. The final drawing, as we know it, was done by Jeff Rat Atkinson. And I feel like that drawing is sort of... I knew the drawing before I knew the band, if that makes sense. I don't know if anyone else felt similar. I
mostly just feel about the Nick Nurse version that the Instagram account Half Good did of Nick Nurse reading his playbook like that. But I do think, there are a handful of albums that have that kind of iconic artwork that stands out, maybe not as much as the music, but alongside the music. Does the cover art do anything for you, Hanif? Like is that part of the lore here with the Descendents?
Maybe, yeah. I mean, or at least the cover art was what drew me to the album. I mean, there's a good handful, I think, of iconic punk aesthetics, the Misfits skull and the Ramones and the Black Flag, that kind of stuff. And Milo Goes to College is among them, but it also, I think, is more approachable than the music sounds. You know what I mean? Like, I feel like you look at the Misfits thing and you look at like the Black Flag thing even, and you kind of know what you're getting into, or even Operation Ivy. Like you look at that stuff, that you're running up on something that maybe is going to sound like it feels. What I loved about the Milo Goes to College cover was that looking at it, it seems really approachable, and you press play on the album, and it is a sonically enjoyable and wonderful but unapproachable record.
To that point, the band, as sort of, I guess we know now in 2020, but at the time, the band's music on this record was obviously a little more melodic and pop oriented than perhaps what was going on in California at the time. Specifically, as you said, like you think about what Black Flag was doing around this time, and it doesn't, there's elements obviously musically, but melodically and vocally, it's a little different than I think what was going on. Aukerman told Stephen Blush, "It's interesting that we started very melodic, then moved to hardcore, but melded the two at a certain point to become melodic hardcore." And you can correct me if I'm wrong. I feel like this is the first sort of quote unquote melodic hardcore record.
I don't know if it's the first ever, but I think it is one of the more prominent firsts.
Right.
I mean, I don't know if, and I'm only saying it's not the first ever because I don't want to miss something historically and then be corrected for the rest of my life. But I also, it feels like an early one, but I also think that, like the Bad Religion record, the first Bad Religion record was kind of melodic, and I guess that came out in 1982 as well, didn't it?
Yeah, I think so.
And so, yeah, I mean, it definitely felt like California was ahead of the curve on that, which I think comes from, a lot of people don't talk about the kind of echoing influence that the original Beach Boys records had. Pet Sounds, sure, but I'm talking like also like Shut Down Volume 2 and like the surf rock records that the Beach Boys did, because I think there was an era of young people who grew up with their parents listening to those records. In the 80s, in the 70s and 80s, I think a lot of those people started bands, and the tools that they had were kind of pulling from the melodies of those surf rock records, which is why the Descendents sounded like they sounded initially, right? They sounded like they sounded before they made Milo Goes to College. They were making like surf rocky melodic things. And so I do think like on the West Coast, the Beach Boys influence and like the Mamas and Papas influence, that stuff can't be understated because, there's kind of a corner of the hardcore and punk world where melody came really natural to a lot of the people in bands, because I imagine at least that's just what was permeating their homes when they were younger.
I think that's probably accurate. I think you can hear that a lot, especially at the beginning of this song from Milo Goes to College, Marriage.
Do you know what I think about you? I don't know
Milo told James Patrick of Filter magazine that with those songs, we were expanding beyond that kind of fast thing. There are some similar coffee-driven songs, but I know that melodically, there was actually an attempt at singing and making more pop-flavored music. Obviously, we all really loved growing up with the Beatles and stuff. And I think it's interesting you mentioned the Beach Boys, Hanif, because there's a couple moments of sort of vocal harmonies on this record that really stuck out to me more as a California Beach Boys sound than a Beatles sound. And I'm sure it's both for them, but I do think it's a really interesting point, especially California-wise.
Yeah, I mean, I'm someone who I grew up in the Midwest, I've lived in the Midwest most of my life and felt very distanced from California music. For most of my teenage years, it's not what my family was listening to. And so my first entry point into California rock was like the Beach Boys and the Mamas and the Papas and that kind of, and then like Jefferson Airplane, kind of psychedelic stuff. And then very quickly into California punk and California hardcore through the Descendents, and X was another one. And for me, it just made sense that these bands were pulling from the bands that they undoubtedly heard growing up. But also, I think the Descendents in particularly had this really brilliant. We talked about how the album is like both long and not, like the volume of songs is there, but the actual length, and which is the thing that I think, like that first Circle Jerks album is like 10 minutes or some shit like that. But the Descendants as writers too, I think, and Milo particularly, had this kind of claustrophobic sense where the songs feel like you're dropped into the middle of a small box and you've got to try to fight your way out of it with this other person, and I think that blended with the pop sensibilities made it really exciting to listen to for me. Like this album and a lot of their work, but particularly this album where I think they were still figuring out their sound. There's that push and pull between a desire to stay committed to pop sensibilities, but also how do I get out of this song as quickly as possible? How do I end this as early as I can?
Do you think, this is just for my almost personal curiosity, but I know as Blake, and maybe this was different for you, but for me, growing up in Toronto and in Canada, that sort of distance you spoke about that you felt to California and California music didn't really exist, because I feel like when I was growing up, it was like there was American music and there was British music and there was Canadian music, and that's just kind of how it all gelled together. Is that sort of distance feeling a common or at least identifiable thing in the States?
For me, like as get where I get both sides of it, but it wasn't conscious for me. And now when I go back and look at who I was listening to when I was in high school and early university as a Canadian who was getting most of their music via online, like it does skew pretty heavily Northeast. So I wonder if that's even like a subconscious thing.
Yeah, I mean, I think part of it too was mythology, like the mythology of, because not only did I not know California music, I hadn't seen California, I'd never been to California. And so there was this thing that was happening when California hip hop had begun to become more prevalent in the Midwest with the Chronic and with Doggy Style, and even before that with DOC, but where it allowed me to envision one corner of California, like the corner that looked the most like my corner in Columbus. Like that's also what happened when I saw Boys in the Hood and when Friday came out. These kind of things where like Black California was being represented made me feel like, okay, now I'm getting a corner of my understanding of the world just in a West Coast shell. But I think with the music like the Beach Boys and everything else that I was getting, it felt like another introduction to that part of the world that I had a harder time making touchable. So therefore it became like a really large mythology. And there was something even romantic about mythologizing of California before I knew it, only through the sounds of it.
Interesting. It's just such a thing that like, it was just a thing that I never experienced. So I was just curious. That's because I grew up like downtown, or if it's like to Blake's point about not, and then the Northeast skew. So I was just curious. Anyway, I think another thing that is notable about this record and Descendents in general is their blending of sort of more personal lyrics and more emotional lyrics into the hardcore scene. Not that there wasn't a little bit of that anyway. Like obviously you think about older punk bands like the Ramones and the Clash, they had personal and emotional lyrics that weren't just political or angry or whatever that sort of got tied in, especially like something like the Buzzcocks very much did that. But for the California hardcore scene, I think that you listen to a song like Hope, and I think that's sort of, at least when I think of this era of music, and not even just in California, like if I think about 7 Seconds, that wasn't really doing that either in the early hardcore scene. And I think that that's what makes a lot of this music notable, at least for me personally, because as someone who has always looked to lyrics and emotional lyrics, I guess, as being important to the record, I think that that must have struck a chord with people that didn't even know what they were looking for.
Why can't you say you talk to me? You're already thinking about someone else. When it comes home, your bed is on and I'll be gone. But I know my day will come. I know someday I'll be the only one. My day will come. I know someday I'll be the only one. So now you want perfection. I see a self-destruction. You don't know what you want. It's gonna take you years to find out. I'm not giving up. And when you've had enough, you'll take your bruised little head and you'll come running back to me. You know that I'm gonna be the only one.
Yeah, Hope is one of the most romantic songs on the record. I think it was, and I think it's one of those songs where so much of emo music and pop punk music, as I came to most become affiliated with in the early mid 2000s, and I think even a little bit before, for better or worse, sometimes very worse, revolves around these ideas of longing and or being kind of like hopelessly in love and running up against the wall of hopelessness and articulating whatever comes out. And Hope kind of falls into that trap a bit where it's one of those songs, I think, where it like hits a turn. It hits a turn where it stops being like maybe tender and thoughtful and inward looking and becomes a little bit more aggressive, to say the least. But I think like that's not to knock the song in general, but I do think that it follows that. It offers up a blueprint that I think a lot of those songs that came after it began to follow.
Photographer Glenn Friedman, who photographed the band extensively in the 80s, said in the documentary about the band Filmage that when he first heard Hope, I had never in my life related to a song about love ever before until I heard that song. I was just like, wow, this is fucking heavy. This guy's hurting more than I am, and this is desperation. A whole new world opened up a depth of emotion in music for me, which I think everything you just said, Hanif, is absolutely true, especially if the blueprint of maybe not the best way of writing love songs that would be influenced. But I think it's this quote from Friedman where he says, I'd never related to a song about love before is so interesting in this scene. And like, obviously this is well before I was born or listening to music, but is there something to be said for like the fact that no one even thought about it before, apparently?
Yeah. Well, I also think, it takes work to identify what a love song is and what a love song looks like to a person. And I don't really know. There are other love songs on this album. I think that this is in some ways like a love song to breaking free from one's kind of boring roots of suburbia. And it's a love song to suburbia in some ways too. I think the one place that I always found myself getting caught up when it came to pop punk or emo or whatever is that it felt like what was identified as a love song felt very narrow often. What people thought were love songs had to kind of follow a narrow route, when instead I just think in other genres it's so easy for me to identify the mode of the love song as a shifting thing that does not need to be centered on a person or does not need to be centered on longing for a person. And I think so much of emo and pop punk is longing for, it's just rooted in nostalgia. It's like longing for a moment before the present moment, which I think that in effect is also a love song.
Other sort of impacts on the writing of this record, all 4 band members contributed songs to this record, which I think is Also interesting, not just for the time, but even now, the way a lot of bands seem to operate. Tony Lombardo's age, as I mentioned off the top, he was 20 years his bandmate's senior, also became a factor in the songwriting for this record. He wrote Suburban Home for exactly the reason he sounds like, that he wanted a home like his parents had.
I want to be stereotyped. I want to be classified.
I wanna be stereotyped. I wanna be classified. I wanna be alone. I wanna suburban home, suburban home, suburban home, suburban home. I wanna be masochistic. I wanna be sadistic. I wanna be alone. I wanna suburban home, suburban home, suburban home, suburban home, suburban home, suburban home.
I want to be stereotyped. I want to be classified.
He said, I definitely wanted a home. I couldn't live in a place where all the people are cool. I don't like dysfunctionality. I have an abhorrence of dysfunctionality because my mother was an alcoholic. My parents are divorced. I just don't need that assault on my emotions and my psyche. I think I wanted to get lost in suburbia rather than embrace suburbia. I live in suburbia now, and I'm still the black sheep on the block. I'm single, no kids, no barbecues, no picnics. My neighbors are hardcore Christians. Nobody bothers me. I couldn't stand to live in a place like Melrose where all the cool people are coming by whenever they want, just dropping in. It's like I'm not a punk. I'd want to be my own person. And I find this super interesting, especially because of the music in punk and pop punk, especially in the next like 10 years after this, that was such a abject rejection of suburbia and longing for that kind of life. And then you have this album and songs like Suburban Home and I'm Not a Punk that are on this extremely influential album that everyone quotes as being influential, that are actively longing for it from Lombardo's perspective. And I just think that's such a, I don't want to say a brave choice because I don't think it was super like actively rebelling at this point, but like I can imagine a band in like 91 writing a song like that and just getting shredded for it.
Well, yeah, right. But it's all about the performance of, it's all about performance, right? And aesthetic, because I guarantee you a lot of those bands that might rebel against that in the 90s had members who were going home to the suburbs or going comfortably and spending time. You know what I mean? Like, maybe I have a different view on this because of my relationship with the suburbs growing up, but I do think I actually appreciate the on its face honesty of longing for suburban comforts on this album, because it feels more realistic to me than the bands of people who perhaps have members who came from like well-to-do backgrounds or comfortable backgrounds talking about how much they hated those backgrounds. It just didn't. I say this as someone who grew up very poor and decidedly not a suburb, but next to a suburb. And I saw up close, and I've written about this a lot. I mean, I saw up close how people largely white from those places would reject the suburb, even though they lived in it, and fought against rejecting the suburb as identity because it brought them closer to this desired punkness, sure, but also this desired like social status. But I think even craving a social status does not take away from the fact that you have certain comforts that the people you dream of being like maybe don't all have. And this isn't painting the whole scene in one, you know, like some folks really were singing about the disdain they had, and they were living that disdain out in their everyday lives. But I kind of like an unabashed look. I mean, we talked about the Wonder Years earlier, and I know we didn't want to circle back and make this podcast about the Wonder Years, but what I think,
no, let's do it.
It's Blake's dream.
But what I think Dan does so well is he has a reverence for where he came from, and the reverence is so large that he understands it to not be without criticism. It deserves criticism, it deserves scrutiny, it deserves frustration, but it also deserves an affection. And so I believe in songs that are capable of towing that line. And I also just kind of believe in the writing of this album that in some ways says, yeah, like I want what my parents had. And the whole concept of this album, right, was that like they thought this would be the only studio album they could make because, well, Milo was going to college. And there's something fascinating about that to me too, that this is a band I was like, all right, our lead singer is going to be going to college to better his life, so let's make this record. Like, there's nothing inherently punk or anti-establishment about, no matter what people project onto this record. There's like nothing punk or anti-establishment about like, we got to make a record because our lead singer is going to go study whatever the fuck at college,
Yeah, and there's a tongue-in-cheekness to the album art about that too, where it's like, yeah, we're a punk band and this is a punk record, but like this is what we're probably going to look like 2 years from now or 4 years from now.
Right. Yeah.
Do you think there's like an inherent hypocrisy, or perhaps a privileged hypocrisy might be more accurate? Like when I think about sort of the, like the 924 Gilman Street scene that would have popped up a couple years after this, where like that's so preoccupied with the idea of authenticity or what they perceive to be authentic. But then what you were just saying about like how authentic this record is, because it's really just what they were thinking and feeling at the time and like wanting that suburban life, which is, I don't think there's anything wrong with that. But then you have like this sort of the Gilman sellout authentic mindset of like banning bands from playing when they signed to major labels. Like, do you think but then idolizing this record, do you think that comes with, I mean, obviously, yes, it does come with a certain amount of privilege, but do you think there is that sort of like the driving hypocrisy of the punk scene that's just sort of always been there?
Well, sure. But I also think it's the hypocrisy of any insular scene where any people can watch some of their direct peers, quote unquote, make it. You know what I mean? Like any scene where there's such a close proximity where there's a group of people all participating in the same action, and then you can watch one group of people or a handful of people also participating in that action ascend to a slightly higher level or a significantly higher level, depending. I mean, I'm someone who was around during the kind of like pop punk boom of the early 2000s. I was around the Midwest. I was around Chicago. And I saw what happened when a lot of those Chicago bands got signed and a lot of those Midwest bands got signed. And I think that there is a lot of things at play there. And I think one of them is a frustration because the scene doesn't have access to a group like they used to, or have access to people like they used to. There is undoubtedly a kind of pain that comes with being able to say, I saw this group first and now I can't see them in the way I used to see them. There's a distance and detachment. All of those things, I think, kind of make this cocktail of frustration that boils down to people feeling like there's a sellout point. But I think one thing too that bears remembering is that even after, I don't particularly believe, my politics and ideas around quote unquote selling out are really different, and I think rooted in are like intensely circumstantial. And I don't even know if I like selling out as a term that or a political thing to follow. But for the sake of this conversation, I think it bears mentioning that even after a band is said to have sold out, there is a larger group that they can sell out. They could be seen as sellouts for again. I think about Green Day all the time, right? Because Green Day went through like 3 to 4 phases of quote unquote selling out. You know what I mean? Because there are some people for whom American Idiot is a sellout point for Green Day. And again, I'm saying this not endorsing the politics of selling out, but just using the overall blanket term. There are people for whom American Idiot was like the sellout point for Green Day, but there are people for whom Warning was a sellout point for Green Day. There are a great many people for whom Dookie was a sellout point for Green Day. You know what I mean? Like, this is a thing that echoes and follows you throughout a whole career. Anytime people get to know you in a certain way, and then you offer yourself up to the world in a different way.
Green Day is an interesting talking point because they're a band that's very clearly, kind of a descendant of the Descendents, a group that were influenced by them, and who knows if they even have the opportunity to sell out, do the Descendents not come along and kind of start or have their hand in the wave. We're going to talk about how Milo Goes to College influenced the entire scene as well as bands like Green Day after this.
So we would be remiss to talk about this record, I think, without acknowledging some of the more problematic aspects of it, so to speak, keeping in mind that it is a record written by teenagers in the early 80s. I'm Not a Loser, which was actually written by Frank Navetta, not by anyone currently in the band, ends with some rather unfortunate, pretty blatantly homophobic lyrics. Whether or not they were intended to be taken as such, I think is another conversation. I'm not going to quote it here, but if you want to know them, you can listen to the song or look them up. They now change the lyrics when the band plays live, although one video I saw didn't change all of it.
Right, yeah.
The song Bikeage that Stevenson wrote he said about a group of girls who were sort of turning into sluts. And if you read the lyrics, it's pretty clearly just slut shaming. There's a whole thread on this on the punk Reddit, our punk, simply titled Milo is a Misogynist, which is an image of the cover, but it has a fedora on it, which I actually found pretty funny. And it sort of spawned a debate on that thread, and I think we can have it now, and it's sort of in music in general, about how ideas and lyrics and bands change throughout time. I think obviously the Beastie Boys are probably the clearest, or at least the most famous example of this, or maybe they just did it the best. I'm not sure what the right terminology is there. In 2018, Aukerman told Creative Loafing that I don't feel a need to atone, but I do feel a need to reflect on who I am today as opposed to who I was then. Really, the only thing I can do is reflect on who I am and put it into my music. And so the songs we write today are reflective of who we are as individuals. We just put out this Who We Are single last year digitally, and a year on vinyl it's coming out on Record Store Day. I wouldn't call it atoning, but I would call it a way of saying, hey, this is who I am now. People evolve, people grow up, people mature, and that's all I can think to put into our music. When songs like this come up, I say, yeah, that's a fun song to play, but God, those lyrics don't resonate anymore, and in fact, they're uncomfortable to sing. Then we'll just not do it anymore. We don't do Loser anymore, and we're not going to be doing Pervert anymore. That was one where many years ago I was like, it's about how I want to have sex. What's the matter with that? And then some other members of the band were like, no, it's creepy. So Pervert's obviously not on this record, but I do think that it's an interesting conversation about, I think probably not playing these songs and probably the right way to go, especially for a band that has such a vast discography. There's no reason to, but I do think that's an interesting discussion around like, how do you reckon with bands who have problematic lyrics, and how do they reckon with their own problematic lyrics?
Yeah. So lately I've been thinking about Paramore, and I've been thinking about Misery Business and Haley's decision to alter the lyrics to Ms. Biz and sometimes not play it. I think she's also kind of steered away from.
Yeah, she stopped doing it live altogether.
Yeah, she stopped doing it live altogether, right? And I remember, and like hats off to Haley, obviously, for more reasons than that one. But I think I remember coming up and looking back, like coming up in the Warped Tour era when Riot was like huge, and Misery Business was maybe the like 25th most problematic song that I'd hear in a day. And there are so few bands, and there are so few bands that have had and I won't name any because I'm not here to but there are so few bands that have had the kind of foresight to say like, okay, let me revisit how I'm presenting this live or because I think that's all you can kind of do, particularly because a lot of these albums were written in different times, and these people are young, not just dudes, obviously we just use Haley, but like a lot of these folks are young, and a lot of these folks are operating in a different political spectrum, not just in the world, but within themselves, right? I mean, I think when the work is out there, you can't take it back, and so it then becomes a question of how do I acknowledge that I am different now? And how do I move forward with how I present this work to the world? Since it already exists, you can't go back, and even if they were to like pull every version of this album off the shelf or pull every version of those songs off, the songs are still out there. People are still going to hear them. It's like, I think some insight and some thoughtfulness on how a lot of these bands reckon with their past songs is something we're going to see an increasing awareness of, I think, because it's not just this album. I mean, there are countless albums across many genres that I listen to and cringe. I will say, I think there are a lot of like emo pop punk albums specifically that I feel a little bit more indicted by, because I remember hearing some of the stuff and feeling, when I was younger, of course, and feeling like vindicated or feeling emotionally cleansed by it. And now being like, oh no, I can't believe, like I have those moments.
Absolutely.
And so I think there's something about pop punk albums that make me at least feel a little more indicted, which I don't think that's bad. I think that's a good thing. But it's again, I think, a real big question of how these bands and how we as listeners of these bands reckon with where we are now and what we loved once. And I don't think that it requires us to detach ourselves from whatever pleasure or comfort these songs gave us when we needed it, right? Like, I don't think we need to punish ourselves for once having needed or loved a song that had something fucked up in it. I think it's instead better to celebrate the fact that we don't need it in the same way anymore.
That's a great way to put it, man.
Do you think that bands and fans, I guess, have, I don't want to make this seem too like black and white and like right and wrong, because obviously it's far more complicated than that. But like, I'm thinking about like Blake, you and I went like 4 years ago, you and I went to see Blink-182, and obviously they have many lyrics that today are like, ooh, but like,
I can't think of a single one.
I remember sort of finding it not odd, because like I was guilty of it as well, because when you're, at the show in the moment, you're caught up as a fan. But like when they were playing Dumpweed, hearing everyone sing that chorus, and again, ourselves included, I want, do you think that's, if you have the awareness of, as you in yourself, which is not the responsibility of the band, but you as yourself, as you were saying, if you have the awareness to sort of not celebrate what that was and to recognize sort of how it made you feel then and how it makes you feel now, I think that is the most important thing. But do bands have a responsibility to make that clear, or can they sort of do the Blink thing and they just like, I mean, I guess all of Blink's music like is kind of like that even today, because it's still 50-year-old Mark Hoppus writing songs about liking a girl in high school. But
yeah.
Do you think that there's, I don't know if responsibility is the right word, but at least like, because like Blink doesn't acknowledge this shit at all, really, because they're like, it's kind of ironic now, I guess. So maybe it takes out, I don't know. I just find it.
Well, that's the thing with Blink, is like the sophomoric aspect of it has always been part of the appeal. And it went from being part of the appeal from a relatability aspect to part of the appeal from like a nostalgic tongue in cheek aspect. So
right.
I feel like they're an example where like there's almost no impetus on them to do it, because it's like almost become part of what they are. As like a snapshot of the early 2000s pulled out into now.
But then like, how do you delineate the parody from the not? You know what I mean? I agree with you. I don't know.
That's a tough question. I don't know the answer. And I think it's something that, taste by taste and band by band. And I think the important thing is, from a listener perspective, like Hanif said, you recognizing that you don't relate to that stuff anymore and you don't need that kind of thing is an important recognition of your own growth. But for bands, I'm not really sure. Like, I guess part of them can just kind of pass that buck on to the listener to figure out for themselves. I don't really know what the answer is there.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if I personally, like, I never trust an audience to figure. I think, I think you got to be like explicit if we're talking Blink. I think, like, at what point does it not become irony when you are? And this is now I'm worried about getting in trouble. I was like, I don't want to go down this road with any specific band, because I was like, damn, if they bring up Blink-182, this is going to be a whole thing.
No, do it, man. This is what we're here for.
I think the thing with Blink that troubles me a little bit is that there's never been kind of like any. And Blink is just kind of a handful of bands who have run into this, but I think they're one of the more popular ones where. Some of that stuff, it just isn't hitting anymore. And at some point, we've like ascended beyond irony, and you're just like the dude singing the shitty songs on stage, and I struggle because I like Blink, and I think Blink has been immensely important to my life. I think more than Blink too, if I'm being honest with myself, like the bands that Blink has allowed for, like Boxcar Racer, is hugely important to me. But the fact that with Blink you have this balance of songs too, where you have enough work that's not like the kind, some of the shittier stuff that you could really sustain off of and build off of, like, and play whole sets off of, and everyone would love. You know what I mean? Like, if you just played Stay Together for the kids, you know, like, no one's going to be like, oh, I'm bummed out to hear this song, you know? But the fact that they kind of lean on and rely on some of the hits that maybe have some, like, shittier ideas in them, and don't talk through that or don't, like, work through that. I'm not saying they have to stop playing the songs, but I think relying on the tongue-in-cheek, we're being ironic and silly, it just doesn't work for me as well as it used to, I think.
And I think I don't mean to keep bringing it back to Beastie Boys, but it's just the one that's playing in my head. But, like, you think about a song like Girls that they have outright apologized for.
Yeah.
That is also tongue-in-cheek, clearly, and sort of on that line of parody. But then they have reckoned with it and they have addressed it. And so I think your point about them resting on those tongue-in-cheek, and, like, not even Blink, like, Angels and Airwaves put out that music video earlier this year of the guy just creeping on that girl in her house.
Oh yeah.
And so it's like, at what point are you not actively not reckoning with it, but, like, still sort of doing it? I don't know.
definitely still sort of. Yeah, that video was wild. I forgot all about that video. I mean, that video was wild because I kept waiting. It was one of those moments where I was like, all right, well, I'm waiting for the turn, you know, like, I'm waiting for this to become
Right.
something different than what it is. And then it got to the end, and that was the end. And I was kind of like, oh, all right, I'm still waiting for the turn. You know, like, maybe there's like a postscript. And at some point, like, just to be like, hella frank, you're just too old for that shit. And so, you're too old for it, and you are dictating, not dictating, but at least putting forward ideas to people who are significantly younger and more emotionally vulnerable than you are. Right.
Yeah. And I think you're leaving space for other artists to then be like that, and they don't have the benefit of ironic detachment from the lyrics because it's 20 years old or whatever, which is something I hadn't really considered when I was talking about the Blink angle earlier, is that, you know, the more you do that and the more you allow for that, whatever the context, the more space that creates, I guess, for other people to hear that and not get it, or to do that themselves and not realize that there is that extra, you know, that extra veil, I guess, for a band like Blink. So you know, maybe the responsibility falls on them because you can't leave that space for other people to then occupy the same kind of way.
Yeah. Though, I mean, don't get me wrong, there's still a lot of Blink songs that I love. And
of course,
Blink is a band that has been very important to me. I mean, I think this is a larger conversation because I mean, I don't listen to the first Fall Out Boy album much anymore. You know, like, this is just kind of like an all-encompassing, like, recently I revisited the first Mayday Parade album Lesson in Romantics? I think so. You know, like, I put on the first Mayday Parade record and I was like, damn, this is rough, you know? And I think we're just all kind of, and I mean, again, I don't want to just I'm hammering away at pop punk and emo here because this is what the podcast is on, but, like, in almost every genre of music I've loved in my life, I run into these things where it's like, well, this is just harder for me to listen to now, but I still really want to celebrate the idea that at one point in my life, this song or this album or this artist maybe got me through a tough time, and now I am here to look back and say, well, I don't know if I need this anymore in this way. And so I think so much of songs and albums and things that don't age well, I wish that part of fandom wasn't rooted around, like, punishing ourselves for once liking these things, because much like the song has already been out in the world, like, the time we spent with that song has already passed. The time we spent loving this song, this album, has already passed, and so there's no undoing it, and there's no and I'm not saying celebrate it, I'm just saying that at some point, I don't know if punishing myself for liking the things that I no longer love is useful as much as it is to say I am grateful because undoubtedly my interest in this thing got me to a better point where I can now look back and say that wasn't the best.
Jake, we're running just a little bit long. Should we get into kind of the influence here and kind of zoom through a little of that before we get to the closing segment? I
think that makes the most sense. So this album was released on New Alliance Records, which is an independent label run by Mike Watt and D. Boone of the Minutemen. It sold 1,000 copies locally on its initial pressing. The band never toured in support of the album because Milo went to college. They would then recruit Ray Cooper as a singer and second guitarist, while Frank Navetta quit the band, burned all his instruments, and became a fisherman, which is great. They would reconvene in 1985 to make I Don't Want to Grow Up. Lombardo would also leave the band in 85 and be replaced by Carl Alvarez, and then Stephen Edgerton would replace Cooper in 1986, which is still the current four-piece of Descendents today. They would release Enjoy in 1986, All in 1987, Everything Sucks in 1996, Cool to Be You in 2004, and Hypercaphium Spazonate in 2016. Obviously, as we've sort of talked about for the last hour, the influence of this record is like almost so large it's hard to put into words. But reception-wise, it has a 4 out of 5 in the Rolling Stone Album Guide, 10 out of 10 in Spin's Alternative Record Guide. AllMusic has called it an unpretentious, catchy winner. Jenny Lescu wrote in Rolling Stone that it's all straight-ahead punk, 15 songs in less than a half hour, each full of metally riffs and lightning speed plucking by bassist Tony Lombardo, who was always the band's secret weapon. Much like The Who, the Descendents often used the bass for melodies and the guitar to bash out a steady rhythm. Songs on this album have been covered by everybody, including MXPX, Fiddler, Taking Back Sunday, Sublime, Face to Face, Baroness, Voodoo Glow Skulls, and this cover by one of my favorite bands, The Bronx.
My room's a mess and I don't care. I'm tired of sitting at my desk. You can't bother me, but yeah, I'm far, far away. I gotta get away to the Catalina wine mixer and you can't ruin my day. You can't tell me what to do, and you cannot make me think that I love you. Shoot it in your arm, you get at me. I'm on my way to Catalina. I'm not gonna reach your book. My temple is squared, it's getting light. And you whores, you can't make me want. I got all the fish I need on the deck of my boat. You can't break my heart when I'm here. I'll swim home from your cute litter. I'll steal some gas, fix my motor, take on some MOT, and get you out of my hair. Get you out of my hair.
Fat Mike, whom you might have heard of, has said this is his favorite record of all time. Dave Grohl said in Filmage that if they had made this record in 1999, they'd be living in fucking mansions, which I think is probably true. Joey Cape of Lagwagon said that the album was just huge in punk, and to me, I don't think there would have been a Lagwagon song like Angry Days without that record. And Andrew Boyan said in Spin's Essential Hardcore write-up, it is super clean, super tight, super poppy hardcore about hating your parents, riding bikes, and not wanting to smell your muff. Obviously, Blink-182 owe a bunch of proud Californian losers everything, which I think says it all.
Yeah, that's pretty good. Hanif, this is the part in the podcast where we normally, we have a living mixtape for the podcast where we pick one song from every episode that kind of best represents the episode or the album that we talked about or the guest's attachment to that album, and we throw it on the mixtape. Does anything spring out to you immediately as a Milo Goes to College song that would fit the mixtape here?
Suburban Home.
All right.
Yeah,
sounds good to me.
I say Suburban Home for sure.
What for I know we talked about the song a little earlier, but what for you makes that song the connection here?
For me, it's the song that most defines the album's central point of anxiety, which is how to perhaps want to make music in the realm they're making music in, to have that desire, but also want to quote unquote survive in the quote unquote real world. And so I love that tension. I love the tension in the song. I love this idea of desire that jumps out in the song, despite the sonic aesthetics of the song. And it just really speaks to a strong tension. Also, I'm glad you mentioned D Boon. Shout out to D Boon. I was thinking about the Minutemen the other day and how much greater their career could have been if he would have not passed away so early.
Jake, any objections on Suburban Home?
No, I think that sums it up great. And I think
what are we gonna do? Argue with Hanif anyway?
Right. And I second your admiration and shouting out to D Boon and the Minutemen, because double nickels on the dime fucking rules.
Oh yeah, classic.
Guys, do you have any closing thoughts before we start to wrap it up here? I guess Hanif, I'll open it to you for any closing Milo thoughts before we let you go.
No, I'm just glad I got to talk about this album for a while. Means a lot, and it was really good, I think, for my brain to get to chat about this.
Man, we're glad. We're pumped you came on. Jake, any thoughts before we wrap up here?
Not really. Just that if anyone is listening to this and is not into the Descendents, go listen to all because it's awesome. The album, not the band, and the band, but I meant the album.
Hanif, thank you so much for coming on. Guys, if you don't know Hanif or you haven't got to know him as deeply yet, at Hanif Muhammad on all socials, Abdurraqib.com. Check out his poetry collections, his essays, wherever he writes. Check it out because whether it's music, culture, sports. So check him out and support him. Hanif, thanks so much, man. This was great.
Oh, thank you so much for having me, y'all. I appreciate it.
Yeah, this was awesome. Thank you so much.